Every morning, as the first light crawled over the acacia trees and spilled across the cracked earth, Nyoka was pulled from the small hut where she and her grandmother slept. Her wrists were calloused from the thick rope that looped around them each dawn. A rough hand would grab her shoulder, and another would tighten the knot at her back, then force her forward, always forward, until she stood before the grand gates of the village chief's compound. She had learned not to cry. The first few days she had screamed and sobbed, clung to doorposts, even bitten the hands that pulled her. But pain and shame, when repeated with the same rhythm as the sun's rising, became something else. They became a part of life. Like hunger. Like thirst. The rope that circled her neck was frayed in places. A dry, scratchy thing that seemed to grow heavier with every step. It didn't pull her tight like a noose, but it was tied in a loop and knotted just behind her ear so that every tilt of her head pressed against the bone. When she stumbled, the rope yanked her back into posture. When she tried to look up, it reminded her where she belonged, on her knees, eyes down, neck bent like a reed broken by the wind. The guards tied her to the post just beside the steps that led to the chief's entrance. Every morning, before the chief took his breakfast, Nyoka was made to kneel. She remained there until the heat grew unbearable, until her skin blistered from the sun, or until a servant remembered to give her a cup of millet water. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes even the dogs were fed before her. Whispers surrounded her. Some villagers watched from the shadows, muttering words she couldn't hear but could always feel, like thorns in the grass brushing against bare feet. That's the girl whose mother betrayed the village. They should have done worse. She carries a serpent's blood. Others stared at her with quiet pity, like one might regard a broken pot. They knew she hadn't committed any crime. But they also knew it wasn't wise to say anything. The chief had decreed it himself. For every moon that passed, she would kneel. For every season, she would pay the debt of her mother's sin. Her mother, Saira, had once been the village herbalist. Beloved. Trusted. But that trust had shattered like thin clay. Accused of poisoning the chief's only son after refusing his advances, Saira had vanished into the forest the night before she was to be executed. Some said she had turned into a hawk and flown away. Others said she had died from her own brew. Either way, her body was never found. The chief had been furious. Robbed of revenge. Denied closure. So he had taken Nyoka instead. She carries her mother's deceit in her blood, he had declared before the village. And blood must answer for blood. No one stopped him. No one dared. Nyoka had only been 7 then. Small and trembling. Her grandmother had tried to fight for her. But she was old, frail, and powerless against men with spears and orders. That day Nyoka had her first taste of rope, the way it bit into the soft flesh of her arms, the way it made her cough when pulled tight around her throat. The punishment was meant to last a week. It had lasted 4 years. Now 11, she no longer looked like a child. Her limbs had stretched out, thin and wiry. Her knees were perpetually scabbed, her shoulders sun-darkened and strong from the daily dragging. Her eyes, however, still held the dull shimmer of a soul holding on. A soul not yet dead. Some of the children laughed at her. Some threw stones. A few left food on the edge of the yard where the guards couldn't see. One old woman who passed every market day whispered, "You are not what they say you are." But even she never stopped to untie the rope. The chief rarely looked at her. He didn't need to. Her bowed head was proof enough that justice was being served. To him she was a symbol, not a person. A breathing, bleeding warning to others. Nyoka had learned to make herself invisible. When her body hurt too much, she escaped into her mind, building stories behind closed eyelids, imagining her mother running through the forest, sword in hand, vowing to return. Sometimes she imagined the rope catching fire and turning to ash. Other times she imagined wings sprouting from her back and lifting her high above the compound, over the hills, beyond the village where no one knew her name. But every time she opened her eyes, she was still there. Kneeling. Bound. Washed. One morning something strange happened. As she was being dragged to the post, she noticed that the rope felt different. Lighter. Looser. She thought it was just wear and tear. But when she knelt, she realized it wasn't just the rope, it was the pull. There was no tug from behind. No sudden jerk to remind her she was owned. She glanced back. The guard tying her hadn't finished the final knot. He was distracted, talking with another guard, laughing about something. For a moment, her hands were free. The rope lay across her lap like a sleeping snake. Her heart pounded. But she didn't move. Didn't dare. The moment passed. The knot was secured. The rope pulled again. She bowed. But something had changed. A thought had been born. A seed planted. What if the rope didn't always have to pull? What if, one day it could be her hand that held the other end? That evening, she sat in silence beside her grandmother. The old woman had grown slower with age, her eyes clouded, but her mind remained sharp. She watched Nyoka stir a pot of boiled cassava and said softly, "Today you came back without bruises." Nyoka said nothing. The old woman reached forward and touched the back of Nyoka's neck. "Your skin is thick now. The rope doesn't know you like it used to." Nyoka turned, surprised. "You noticed?" "I notice everything," her grandmother said, smiling faintly. "Even the way you walk now, not like prey but like someone listening." Nyoka looked at her hands, then at the rope that lay coiled in the corner. "The same one used each morning." "I think it's starting to change," she whispered. "No," her grandmother said. "It's you who's changing." That night, Nyoka dreamed of a rope that danced like a ribbon in the sky, weaving around trees and mountains, wrapping itself into knots only she could untie. She stood barefoot beneath a giant tree and the rope curled at her feet, not around her neck. It whispered to her in her mother's voice, "When the rope starts pulling back, don't run. Follow it." She woke up before dawn, her heart pounding with something she hadn't felt in years. Oh. And outside, the rope waited for her once more. The rope had become part of her, as familiar as her own breath. It rested around Nyoka's neck with a quiet cruelty, coarse against her skin, always there to remind her of a mother whose face was fading in her memory. They said the curse started when the chief's only son grew sick with a wasting illness, bones sharp against flesh, eyes sunken like old wells. When no cure could be found, fingers turned to blame. The village healer, grasping at superstition, accused her mother of jealousy, of sowing a curse through herbs and hidden chants. Nyoka had watched them drag her mother away screaming, arms outstretched, trying to reach her. Her mother's final words before disappearing into exile were burned into Nyoka's spirit. "I did no evil. I only healed. Remember that, my daughter." But no one else remembered it that way. The rope was placed around Nyoka's neck the very next day. She was just 8 years old, thin-legged and trembling in her torn wrapper. The village assembled as they tied her and led her to the chief's yard. Her knees were forced to the earth, dust blooming beneath her like a cruel flower. The servant, always the same one, stood behind her, holding the end of the rope like reins. If she dared straighten her back even slightly, he would pull, hard. Once he pulled so sharply she bit her tongue and blood colored her chin. The punishment, they said, was not hers, but a tradition to remember what her bloodline had done. Every morning as the sun rose, she was led like cattle to the yard and made to bow. The villagers passed by, some looked away in guilt, others with cold detachment. A few spat, whispering, "Which blood stains deep." There were those who brought their children to see her, saying it was a lesson in obedience. And still, every day Nyoka bowed. As years passed, the daily ritual carved her spine into a question mark. Her bones adjusted to the posture of punishment. Even when she was not kneeling, her shoulders hunched as if the rope was still there. It never truly left, not even when the servant untied her and she walked home with her eyes down, throat sore from silence. Nyoka remembered her mother's laughter dimly now, like wind behind a closed window. But she remembered the herbs her mother taught her to crush, the way she whispered to plants before boiling them. Her mother had healed many, even those who later stood by as she was accused. Nyoka did not know if her mother had truly cursed the chief's son. What she knew was that her mother never taught her hate. Only how to soothe a fever. How to read the language of pain in the body. One day, as the servant tied the rope again and forced her to kneel, Nyoka looked up, not at him but at the sky. It was wide and deep and refused to bow. She wondered if her mother's spirit lived in that sky, watching each morning from the blue silence. The villagers no longer whispered as much. Her punishment had become routine, like roosters crowing or fires being stoked. It was no longer about her mother's alleged sin. It was about control, about memory, about keeping the story alive through her bowed spine. She understood now, they needed someone to carry the weight, to make the past visible. But the rope didn't just pull at her neck, it wound its way through her identity. There were days she woke up choking from dreams, her fingers clutching at her throat even in sleep. There were days she hated her mother for leaving her behind. And then hated herself for thinking it. The servant behind her, a man named Boileau, had changed over time too. He was older now, with a limp that slowed his pace. But his hands remained steady when pulling the rope. Nyoka often wondered what he thought as he held her leash. Was he ashamed? Did he see her as a threat? Or had he also become part of the tradition, another thread in the rope that bound her? One afternoon a child, no more than 4, approached as she knelt. The girl looked at Nyoka's face, her eyes wide and unsure. "Why do you kneel every day?" Nyoka could not answer. Her mouth had not spoken freely in years. But she looked at the girl and offered a faint, painful smile. "She kneels so we don't forget," the child's mother whispered, pulling her away. "Forget what?" Nyoka closed her eyes. Her mother's face returned to her, not as a scream but as a lullaby. In that memory there was no rope, no punishment. Just hands braiding her hair, and the smell of crushed mint leaves on her mother's skin. Nyoka bowed again, not from force but from grief. Not for herself, but for all that had been twisted by lies. For the weight of sins that might never have been committed. For the silence she'd been forced to carry like an invisible scream. The rope tugged again, reminding her the day was not done. But in her heart, attention began to shift. Not break, but tighten in the opposite direction, like something ancient remembering its strength. She bowed still. But something deep inside had begun to stand. The sun was cruel that morning, burning into the back of Nyoka's neck like a second rope. She had been bowing for what felt like hours, though she knew it hadn't even been half of one. The servant behind her yawned lazily, holding the rope like he always did, one end looped loosely in his fingers, the other tight around her neck. If she dared lift her head even a little too high, he would give a casual tug to remind her of her place. But today something was different. The dirt beneath her knees was dry as always, but it felt warmer. Not from the sun, but from something deeper, something alive. Her palms, pressed into the dusty soil, began to tremble, not out of weakness but because they were listening. She blinked slowly. There was no breeze. No bird song. Only the muffled murmurs of the villagers beyond the fence and the ever-present silence of shame. And yet she heard something else. A whisper. At first she thought it was the servant speaking, or maybe her own thoughts turning into sound. But then it came again, clearer this time, like a sigh that knew her name. Nyoka. Her breath caught. The whisper wasn't above her. It was below her. In the ground. In the spaces between pebbles and roots and old bones. She pressed her fingers into the soil a little deeper, and the whisper continued, not in words she knew, but in feelings she understood. It was like a drumbeat turned to breath, rhythmic, earthy, pulsing. Images flickered behind her eyes. A woman, proud and tall, standing barefoot in a forest. Her mother. She could see her mother's hands planting something. Seeds? No, truths. She was hiding something in the earth. A secret? A protection? A memory? The rope pulled gently, a warning. Nyoka slumped forward again, but her eyes stayed wide. Her ears tuned not to the scoffing of passers-by or the creaking gate of the chief's compound, but to the hum of the soil. The whispers began to shape themselves. Her mother's voice was among them, soft but sure. They turned my face to the wind, but the earth turned it back. Nyoka's heartbeat quickened. They broke my name, but the roots remembered. Something under the ground shifted, like a snake turning in its sleep. Nyoka didn't flinch. She didn't dare move. But a single tear ran down her cheek and fell into the dirt. The soil drank it quickly. From the corner of her eye she noticed a tiny sprout, a green thread pushing through the dry earth. It hadn't been there a moment ago. No one else seemed to notice. The whispers returned. They forced you to bow, but the ground knows who carries weight. The innocent do not sink. They root. Nyoka's spine tingled. She didn't know how to answer. She didn't even know if she was supposed to answer. But her fingers, almost without her will, began to trace circles in the dust. Not symbols. Not letters. Just patterns. Spirals. Loops. Like a rhythm her body remembered. Behind her, the servant sneezed and kicked at the dust with irritation. He muttered something about the heat and spat near her feet. But she didn't flinch. Instead she listened deeper. She thought of the day they tied the rope around her neck for the first time. How her mother's cries had echoed through the village as they dragged her away. How Nyoka had been told over and over, bow for the sin. Bow for the shame. Bow so you remember your place. But now the ground whispered, your place is deeper than their memory. Your place is written in the soil. A low rumble passed through her knees. No one else reacted. It wasn't an earthquake. It was something quieter. Older. And the rope, it had always felt heavy. But now it felt different. Not just heavy. Alive. Like it knew something was changing. The servant behind her shifted uneasily. Perhaps he felt it too. Her back, sore and bent, twitched with the instinct to rise. She didn't move. Not yet. But she allowed herself to breathe a little deeper, chest rising just a touch. The rope tugged reflexively. She didn't resist. But she smiled. Just a little. Because now she knew. The rope wasn't hers. but neither was the guilt. And buried beneath her knees were the truths her mother had planted. The roots were remembering. And soon the village would have to. Nyoka pressed her fingers deeper into the soil. The sprout beside her grew half an inch. And the earth whispered one more thing before falling quiet again. They made you bow. But they forgot that even bowed heads still hear the ground. And the ground never forgets. The servant yawned again, bored, not noticing that the girl was no longer broken. The villagers walked past the gate, unmoved, unaware. But Nyoka heard everything. And that was enough. For now. Because when the rope finally pulls again, she won't just resist. She'll pull back. The days dragged on, and the sun continued to rise over the chief's compound like a silent witness to Nyoka's suffering. Each morning, the servant led her to the center of the yard, bound the coarse rope around her neck, and forced her to bow low, face nearly to the earth. But ever since the whispers in the soil had started, something subtle had shifted. The rope, once limp and obedient to its handler, began to behave oddly. It resisted. Not with violence or rebellion, but with memory. The first time it happened, the servant gave a tug and frowned. Nyoka had not moved. It wasn't that she was disobeying, but rather that the rope itself had seemed to stretch, unwilling to tighten as quickly or as harshly as it once did. The servant yanked again, harder this time, and Nyoka fell forward, but not completely. It was as though the rope hesitated, confused about its role. Whispers buzzed through the village like swarms of bees. They came from behind pots, from around fire circles, from under woven mats. The girl's rope, it does not pull like before. Perhaps her mother's curse is real after all. Maybe the rope remembers something we don't. Nyoka heard the talk but said nothing. She had grown used to silence. It was safer. But at night, when she returned to her hut at the farthest edge of the village, she began to test the rope. She tied it loosely to her wrist and sat in the dark. She asked it questions, whispered her thoughts into its twisted fibers. Sometimes it twitched in response. Sometimes it warmed. And once, just once, it pulsed like a heartbeat. It was on one such night that the elder priestess came. She arrived without warning, as quiet as a shadow, her robes like smoke drifting through the door. Nyoka sat up quickly, hiding the rope behind her back, heart pounding. But the priestess did not come to scold. She knelt slowly before the fire pit and looked at Nyoka. Not with pity, not with disdain, but with recognition. I dreamed of a girl bound in silence, the priestess said, voice low like a drumbeat. Her neck held low, but her spirit climbing trees unseen. Nyoka didn't speak. The priestess extended her hand. May I touch the rope? Hesitant but trusting, Nyoka revealed it and handed it over. The priestess placed her palm on the knot and closed her eyes. Moments passed. Then she opened them and whispered, "This rope is no longer theirs. It is listening to you now." Nyoka blinked. Listening? It was once a weapon, the priestess murmured. But even weapons remember. Blood stains. Tears soak. Skin imprints. What they used to silence you has become a witness instead. The rope twitched slightly in her palm. The priestess smiled faintly. They think they are forcing you to bow. But it is the rope that is learning how to rise. The next morning, Nyoka walked to the compound with a quiet fire in her belly. The servant tied the rope as usual, tight around her neck, and stepped back with a practiced sneer. The village had gathered once more, some out of habit, others to see the strange magic for themselves. As always, Nyoka bowed. But when the servant gave the first tug, nothing happened. Not a jerk. Not a drop. Only stillness. The rope was taut, but unmoved. The servant frowned and pulled again. The rope tightened slightly, but it did not force Nyoka's head to the ground. Her posture bent, yes, but with control. Her chin hovered just above the dirt. Her spine trembled but held. She was neither defiant nor obedient. She was something else entirely. The people gasped. The chief stepped out of his compound, narrowing his eyes. "Pull harder," he ordered. The servant obeyed, straining with both hands. But now the rope moved on its own. It loosened. Just enough. It let Nyoka lift her face and meet the eyes of those around her. A murmur rose in the crowd like thunder in the belly of the earth. Children clutched their mothers. The old priest mumbled a protection charm. Even the chief stepped back, unsure. That night, the priestess returned. "The rope does not belong to men anymore," she said. "It belongs to truth." Nyoka touched her neck, feeling the faint heat left behind. What happens now? The priestess looked toward the forest beyond the village. Ropes can bind. But they can also remember. You are not bound anymore, not unless you choose to be. From that night on, Nyoka no longer feared the rope. She wore it like a sash when she walked, light across her shoulder, not as a mark of shame but as a thread of memory. It still whispered when the wind blew, still pulsed when the moon was full. And every time the servant reached for it in the morning, it flickered slightly, reminding the world that it now served a different master. The rope had remembered, and in doing so, it had begun to rewrite its own purpose. The air was thick with incense and smoke from roasted yams. Drums pounded low and steady in the distance, the kind that crawled into your bones before you even heard them in your ears. Nyoka stood in the dusty center of the village square, her knees already aching in anticipation of what would come. She didn't flinch when the servant approached with the rope. It was part of the ritual by now. Her neck had learned its weight. Her spine had memorized the slump. But this time something felt different. The harvest ritual was the most sacred event of the season, meant to bless the crops and honor the ancestors. It was also, cruelly, the most visible moment of her humiliation. For as long as she could remember, Nyoka had been made to bow before the village, the rope tight around her neck, her body a living reminder of a woman no one dared speak of without contempt. As the people gathered, dressed in vibrant cloths and golden beads, the chief stepped forward. His laugh boomed as he welcomed the crowd, then gestured to Nyoka, his words dripping with disdain. "Let this child's neck remind us what happens when curses are sown instead of millet." The crowd chuckled uneasily. Some of the children looked away. Others stared openly. A few elders, eyes clouded with years and shame, held their silence like stones in their mouths. The servant gave the rope a tug. Nyoka's head dipped, but the resistance wasn't the usual dead weight. The rope pulled, but it didn't drag her down. It trembled. Then, it lifted. Slightly. Barely. But enough for her to feel it hovering, as if unsure whether it belonged to her or the hand that held it. The chief's son, Ntemi, barked from the front row. "Push her down. The rope grows weak." He stormed forward, grabbing the rope himself. He pulled hard, a grin on his face, expecting the satisfying jerk of control. But the rope refused him. It held in the air like a taut vine tied to a tree no one could see. Ntemi's smirk faltered. He pulled harder. Nyoka didn't move. The rope trembled. Then, like a gust slipping through the world's hidden cracks, a wind rose from the east. It wasn't the kind that rustled skirts or stirred cooking fires. It was the kind that made people hold their breath. The kind that left no footprints but touched everything. The rope coiled slightly, shimmering faintly as it hovered above her shoulders. Ntemi, startled, tugged again, but this time the rope whipped from his grasp, curling midair like a living thing. He stumbled backward, landed on his side and gasped. A hush fell over the courtyard. The drums stopped. Every eye turned to the girl still standing, rope floating just above her skin, her face tilted upward for the first time in years. "The rope has chosen," someone whispered. Another voice echoed it, stronger this time. "The rope has chosen." Then a third, "The rope has memory." The wind pushed through the branches of the ancestral trees, sending a wave of rustling through the leaves like whispered approval. Nyoka stood tall, her eyes glowing with the echo of something older than pain, older than punishment. The humiliation she had carried like a second skin began to fall away in invisible sheets. The chief tried to speak, but his throat caught. He looked at his son, then at the elder priestess, who had quietly emerged from the edge of the crowd. Her gaze met Nyoka's with a quiet fire. "This is no curse," the priestess said, her voice sharp. "This is a reckoning." The rope dropped gently to the ground, curling like a sleeping serpent. Nyoka didn't flinch. The crowd backed away, not in fear but in awe. She stepped forward, barefoot on the earth that had whispered to her, the soil that had remembered her mother's name when the people had not. Her spine, once broken by years of forced obedience, stood proud and unyielding. The same spine that had bent each morning, now lifted by a power no man could touch. No one dared stop her as she walked past the chief, past his son, past the servant who still held the frayed end of the rope like it might rise again. But it didn't. Its purpose was finished. Its loyalty had shifted. Behind her, a girl began to clap. Then another. Soon, hands joined in waves of rhythm, not the beats of punishment, but of praise. The chief looked around, his power draining with each clap. He tried to shout, but the wind swallowed his voice. The drums began again, but this time, their rhythm was unfamiliar, reverent, defiant. Nyoka paused at the far end of the yard. She turned slowly. For the first time in her life, she looked at the crowd not from below but eye to eye. And when she spoke, her voice was like rain after fire, soft, steady, unstoppable. "I bow to remember. But I rise so you won't forget." The wind circled her feet like a promise kept. And from that day on, the rope never touched her neck again. Nyoka sat in the stillness, unsure how long she'd been kneeling. Her knees ached from the damp ground, but she didn't rise. Something held her, not fear, not pain, but a gravity in the air that felt sacred. The vine on her wrist pulsed softly, in rhythm with her heartbeat, as though it were listening. The night deepened. Mist crept low across the forest floor, wrapping her ankles. Fireflies blinked into life around her like shy witnesses. Somewhere behind the trees, the wind shifted and carried a whisper, not a word but a tone she recognized. Her mother used to hum like that when grinding herbs or stirring porridge, low and warm, a sound of life moving forward no matter how heavy the past. Nyoka opened her mouth and hummed back. As the notes left her lips, the vine seemed to tighten slightly in recognition. The soil before her stirred again. This time not a vine, but a series of small glowing seeds pushing up from beneath. They were warm to the touch, pulsing red and gold. She cupped them gently, and the warmth spread through her arms into her chest, filling the space where silence had long nested. Her breath caught. Her mother had planted something here, not just her body but her spirit, her resistance, her memory. Nyoka had thought she was coming to mourn, but now she saw. This was a homecoming. She rose slowly, her hands still cradling the seeds. The vines around her wrists coiled upward like ceremonial cloth, forming patterns, symbols older than the village itself. As she walked back through the forest, she noticed how the path felt less wild. The thorns seemed to bend slightly out of her way. Even the air felt easier to breathe. When she emerged from the trees, the village gates loomed ahead, quiet and unaware. But Nyoka didn't go to her hut. She walked to the center of the village, where the sacred fire pit lay cold from last week's ritual. Without hesitation, she stepped inside the circle and knelt, not in submission, but in offering. She pressed the glowing seeds into the ash. Nothing happened at first. But then the coals shimmered and a small flame flickered to life. The wind curled around it, feeding it gently. In moments the pit glowed orange-red. Villagers peeked from their huts. Whispers flew like birds. "She's lighting it alone? That's forbidden? The rope girl?" The chief's son emerged, puffed and angry. "Who gave you permission?" The flame flared, casting long shadows across his face. He stumbled back. Then the elder priestess arrived, robes flowing like smoke. Her eyes found Nyoka, then the vine-wrapped wrists, then the fire. Her voice trembled, not with fear but awe. "The flame has returned." And the people, unsure, gathered close. They saw the girl with no rope, no chains, only living vines where shame used to cling. They saw her kneeling not in defeat but in devotion. They saw the fire they had once claimed was cursed now lighting their path again. In that moment, Nyoka understood something deeper than revenge. Her mother had not fought to burn the village down, she had fought to leave behind something that would outlive the lies. The vine. The seed. The flame. The rope had once dragged her down. Now the roots pulled her upward. And in the glow of the rekindled fire, they all saw it, the exiled flame had never died. It had simply been waiting for someone brave enough to kneel in truth. The sun rose sharp and golden on the day of the trial, casting long shadows across the village square. Word had spread quickly, faster than gossip usually dared, and now, from every dusty path and woven doorway, villagers emerged like ants to witness the moment they believed would end a mystery. Nyoka, the girl who bowed with a rope around her neck, was to be judged for sorcery. She stood in the middle of the clearing, alone, eyes steady, the red vine from her mother's grave still loosely wrapped around her wrist like a symbol too ancient to name. The elders sat high upon carved wooden stools under the canopy of the judgment tree, the same place where her mother had been condemned years ago. A bitter wind moved through the leaves, whispering secrets that only those who truly listened could hear. The chief, dressed in gold threads and thick pride, lifted his staff and struck it once against the stone beside him. "Nyoka," he said, voice heavy with performance, "you stand accused of summoning spirits to defy the traditions of this land. You wear a vine like a crown, you walk with your head high when it should kiss the earth. Who has taught you such rebellion?" Nyoka said nothing. He motioned toward the rope, now lying coiled in a calabash bowl held by one of his guards. "This rope," he continued, "is not just a tool. It is memory. It is justice. It humbled your mother and now it will humble you." Two guards approached her. The older one hesitated, eyes darting toward the vine on her wrist. The younger one was bolder. He reached into the bowl and grabbed the rope, only for it to squirm in his hands like a live thing. It slithered up his forearm, coiled tightly, and then snapped forward, striking his chest and sending him flying backward into the dust. The crowd screamed. The rope dropped to the ground. Motionless. Waiting. The chief stood. "Trickery," he roared. "She controls it. Restrain her." But no one moved. Nyoka stepped forward slowly, the vine trailing behind her like a shadow that had learned to speak. "You say I control it," she said, her voice neither loud nor meek, "but have you ever asked what it remembers? What it chooses?" She turned to the rope. "Come." The rope stirred. It rose from the ground, spiraling upward until it hovered in front of her, swaying gently like a snake sensing the wind. Then, in front of everyone, it looped itself around her waist, not tightly, not cruelly, but like an embrace. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The elder priestess, silent until now, stepped from behind the judgment tree. Her voice was dry but powerful. "The rope has seen many hands," she said, "but never one that it chose. Until now. You say this is sorcery? No, chief. This is remembrance. This is justice finally rising from the dust." The chief's face reddened, fury bubbling under his skin. "You defend a traitor's daughter." The priestess raised her chin. "I defend truth. And truth does not bow for comfort." A young girl in the crowd stepped forward and knelt beside Nyoka. Then another. And another. Soon, a line of children had formed, all kneeling not out of submission, but in quiet solidarity. They bowed not because they were forced, but because they chose to honor her strength. The rope slithered from Nyoka's waist and darted up the judgment tree, where it coiled high above, hissing softly like a sentinel. The chief stepped back, uncertain now. "This is madness." "No," the priestess whispered, "this is reckoning." Nyoka turned to the people. "My mother was not a curse. She was silenced for seeing too much. This rope remembers her agony. And now it remembers mine. But it will no longer drag us down. It will rise." In the silence that followed, even the birds held their breath. The trial, as it was planned, never concluded. The chief left in silence. The elders said nothing. But from that day on, no one dared bring the rope near Nyoka again. It had chosen. And when the winds moved through the village, they carried not the laughter of cruelty but a different sound, the soft rustling of a rope high in the tree, humming a song only truth could hear. The morning after the trial was different. The sky hung low, thick with a silence that stretched over the village like a woven cloth soaked in breathless tension. Smoke curled slowly from cooking fires, but conversations were hushed. Doors remained half-closed. The earth itself seemed to wait, holding its rhythm for what was coming. Nyoka stood alone at the edge of the square, barefoot, her feet rooted to the earth like the judgment tree itself. Her back was straight, her eyes no longer searching for approval but seeing clearly. The rope, that red vine-turned serpent, now coiled around her shoulders, resting like a living mantle. It was no longer a symbol of punishment. It was memory. It was weapon. It was witness. She began to walk. Each step forward struck the ground like a promise kept. The villagers watched from the shadows of their huts, from behind walls, from rooftops where children clutched their mothers' waists. No one spoke. No one moved. They simply watched the girl who had once eaten from the floor, who now walked toward the compound of the most powerful man in the land, without fear, without an escort, without chains. The chief's compound loomed at the village's far end, surrounded by tall fences carved with lion heads and sacred sigils meant to ward off spirits. But today even the air inside it trembled. The guards saw her approach, but they did not raise their spears. They parted like reeds before the current. Something in her presence made their weapons feel like wood in the face of fire. The rope around her pulsed, sensing the place, the weight of old echoes, of cries swallowed behind thick doors. Nyoka stepped through the compound gate. Inside, the chief sat on his throne, a towering structure made of elephant tusks and redwood, meant to intimidate all who entered. His gold-wrapped fingers twitched against the arms of the seat. His eyes, once full of sharp pride, narrowed as Nyoka approached. He opened his mouth to command her to stop. She didn't. She stepped right into the sacred circle, the forbidden zone where only royal feet could tread. Still the guards did nothing. The rope around her began to uncoil. It moved on its own, slowly at first, snaking down her arms, sliding onto the floor, hissing softly like breath escaping a buried truth. It crawled across the tiled path, leaving a faint trail like a fire line through dry grass. The chief watched in disbelief as the rope circled the base of his throne. "Stop," he whispered. The rope didn't. It climbed higher, coiling up the legs of the chair, wrapping around the carved tusks, crossing over his arms, and then tightening like a muscle contracting in rage. The throne groaned. The air grew heavy. A loud crack echoed as one of the tusks splintered. The chief screamed. The villagers began to gather just outside the gate, drawn by the noise, by the pull of something ancient playing out in the open. No one stopped them. No one dared. Inside, Nyoka stood still. She raised her hand. "This rope," she said, her voice echoing like a bell through the stunned silence, "was once used to humble the innocent. It dragged my mother. It bruised her skin. It burned my throat. It was fed with lies and made to obey the wicked." She looked the chief in the eye. "But the rope remembers. And today it pulls back." The rope tightened again. The throne shuddered, and the chief was forced down into his seat, as though the weight of every cry he'd silenced was being laid upon him at once. The rope didn't strangle him, it held him there. Trapped. Powerless. Not harmed. But judged. Outside, a low murmur rose among the people. "He's bound." She didn't touch him. The rope chose. The priestess appeared once more, stepping through the crowd with grace born of storms. She entered the compound without waiting for permission and stood beside Nyoka. "It is finished," she said softly. Nyoka didn't speak. Her eyes were locked on the chief. She had no need to say more. The rope had spoken louder than 1,000 testimonies. Then she turned and walked away. The rope loosened, slithering off the throne and following her like a shadow now free to choose its master. The chief remained in his seat, breathing hard, staring into the air as if it had turned against him. When Nyoka exited the compound, the villagers parted for her. No one bowed. Instead, they stepped aside with quiet reverence. Even the children, usually full of play, stood straight like trees in her wake. A boy, no older than 7, ran up to her and touched the rope. "It's not scary anymore," he whispered. Nyoka looked down at him. "It never was. It just needed someone to listen." She continued walking, the rope curling back around her like a sash. She did not return to the hut where she had once slept on the floor. She walked past it. She walked to the fields, past the well, beyond the tree where her mother's voice still hummed in the bark. And the wind followed her, carrying no more screams, only songs. Songs that the rope remembered. Songs that the land had waited to hear again. The morning after the chief's fall was quiet in a way that made even the birds pause. No orders were shouted. No rope was brought. The space where Nyoka once knelt, pressed into the dust, was now bare. Only the imprint of her final stance remained, a silent mark where defiance had bloomed. Word of what happened spread like fire through dry grass. Every hut, every market stall, every gossiping circle of elders was humming with the tale. Children mimicked the moment, wrapping vines around sticks and declaring, "This one judges now." Men who once turned their faces away from Nyoka's humiliation now bowed their heads, not from shame but in apology. Women clutched their daughters tighter, whispering, "She stood and so shall you." Nyoka herself did not revel. She did not speak for many days after the rope fell. Her silence was not emptiness but weight, a quiet that carried more than noise ever could. She returned to the yard each morning, not to bow but to walk across it with bare feet, her head high. The ground beneath her, once her prison, now seemed to rise with her step. Even the wind changed, it swirled behind her like a cloak. At the center of the village, where the rope had been tied and pulled for years, she brought the red vine that had grown at her mother's grave. It had curled around her wrist like a friend, gentle, persistent, warm. Now she planted it at the edge of the compound, pressing it into the earth where the rope had once dragged her neck downward. Children gathered around her as she dug the soil with her hands. "What's it called?" one of them asked. Nyoka looked up, dust on her cheeks, and replied, "Truth root." The elders had no name for the red vine. It had never grown in the village before. But since that day, it began to sprout in corners where lies had once festered. Beside wells, outside the judgment hut, even near the chief's former throne. The vine did not strangle. It blossomed, slowly, defiantly. The chief's compound was torn down. No one claimed his crown. No heir stepped forward. The place where his throne had once sat was turned into a circle of flat stones, where the people gathered to speak and listen, to remember and rebuild. Decisions were no longer handed down by decree but shaped in dialogue. Nyoka was invited to speak. The first time, she stood before them wrapped in a robe her mother had once sewn. It had been hidden away by a neighbor who believed in her mother's innocence and had saved it in silence. When Nyoka wore it, the air itself felt charged. They asked her to lead, to take the place of the chief. She shook her head. "I will not be bowed by a throne either," she said. Instead she offered stories. Every 7 days the villagers would gather around the red vine, and Nyoka would speak, not commands but memories. She told of her mother, of the first day the rope touched her skin, of the earth's whispers, of the moment her spine refused to fold. She spoke of pain as seed, of shame as fire, and of how even a girl bent low could rise higher than those seated above. Children began to imitate her voice and play. Girls painted red vines on their arms with crushed berries. Boys braided ropes and tied them around tree trunks, only to watch them unravel again. A new proverb was born: stand straight like Nyoka, and the rope will never own you. But not everyone accepted the change. Some muttered behind walls, claiming the rope was cursed, or that the wind was bewitched. They feared the truth root, saying it would wrap around the village's roots and tear it apart. One old priest, the last of the chief's council, tried to cut the vine in the dead of night. In the morning he was found tangled in it, not strangled, not hurt, but unable to move until Nyoka arrived and touched the vine. Loosened. She spoke no threat, only a warning: what grows from truth cannot be killed by fear. Slowly, even those who doubted began to believe. Not in Nyoka as a ruler but in themselves. Women started walking taller. Men apologized for years of silence. Children played openly with those they were once forbidden to speak to. A village once ruled by a bowed ritual began to dance. The place where Nyoka once bowed became a sacred space, not for worship but for memory. Each year on the day the rope fell, the villagers gathered. They brought no offerings, only stories. Some spoke of the day they first saw her rise. Others admitted how they had looked away too long. And Nyoka would simply listen, letting the silence between each word stretch long and deep. She never sought revenge. Not against the guards who had yanked the rope. Not even against the chief's son, whose bruised pride had once dragged her through the dirt. He came to her one evening, his head bowed, not forced but heavy with regret. She offered him a cup of water and left him to sit beside the red vine, alone. When he finally stood, he left without a word but with lighter shoulders. Years passed. Nyoka aged, though slowly. Her presence remained rooted. Even when the seasons changed, she could be seen walking through the yard with her back straight and her eyes steady. Children still followed her, asking about the whispers in the soil. She would place a hand on the earth and say, "Listen. It remembers." No one dared put a rope on another's neck again. Not out of fear but respect. They had seen what happened when truth is buried, and what it means to dig it back up. The rope that once humbled the innocent had become a symbol not of punishment, but power reclaimed. And so, when travelers passed through and asked about the strange vine in the center of the village, the people would tell them, "This grew where a girl once bowed. She did not stay down. And neither shall we." The rope still hung in the community circle, but it was not tied. It lay coiled in a basket beside the vine, untouched. Sometimes children asked to hold it, to feel its weight. When they did, they were taught not how to use it but how to resist it. And every time Nyoka stood near the truth root, the wind would stir, gentle and warm, as if the earth itself were bowing back. The rope now hangs silently from the great tree that grows over her mother's grave. Where once it choked, humbled, and humiliated, it now dangles gently in the breeze, neither feared nor forgotten. Its fibers, worn and weathered, are not rotting. Somehow they have outlived even the tallest elders of the village. Time has not frayed it, only softened its bite. The people no longer call it the punishment rope. Now they call it the rope that remembers. Nyoka, gray-haired and slow in step, often sits beneath the tree in the late hours, her feet bare and resting on the soft soil her mother was buried in. Children gather, not in fear but in reverence. They bring pebbles with secret names carved on them, names of people who were silenced, wronged, or forgotten. One by one they place the pebbles in the soil near the tree roots. The ground has become a sanctuary. The stories whispered here grow like seeds, and the tree drinks every word. Each morning women come to speak softly to the rope. They do not tug it or try to possess it. They simply press their foreheads to it and say what they were never allowed to say aloud. He struck me when no one watched. She told me I was worthless. I was forced to lie. I watched and said nothing. The rope listens, always swaying as if nodding in solemn understanding. It never replies with words, but those who speak to it leave a little lighter, as if the rope has drawn the burden into itself. There are no trials held under the tree. There are no punishments. Only truth. Nyoka, sitting on her mother's favorite woven mat, now old and wise, is approached by those who once avoided her eyes. Even the descendants of the chief come. Some bring offerings of yam or water. Some bring silence. She does not judge them. The rope has already done that. One day, a girl comes running to the tree with tears on her cheeks. She is young, maybe the same age Nyoka was when the rope first touched her neck. The girl clutches her chest as though words are too heavy to lift. She reaches out, touches the rope and simply says, "They said I lied." The rope lifts slightly, brushing her hand like a mother's touch. It falls back still, but everyone around sees it, and no one questions her again. That night, Nyoka returns to the tree alone. She kneels, slowly, her knees pressing into the earth. She places her hands on the ground and whispers, "It worked, Mama." They remember now. The tree rustles even though there is no wind. The rope sways even though there are no hands. Somewhere nearby, a child laughs in her sleep. Years from now, when Nyoka is gone, people will tell stories of her courage. Of the rope that would not strangle her spirit. Of the bough that became a spine. Of the tree that grew from a mother's unjust grave and turned into a monument of truth. But most of all, they will tell of a rope that once dragged a child through shame, but now pulls only toward one direction: justice. Quiet, unwavering, eternal.